Oh, your favorite podcast has just downloaded, sir. Welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast. In this episode of the podcast, I talk to Giles Parkinson. Now, he's an ex-financial journalist who now writes a fascinating blog called Reneweconomy. We discuss the availability of renewable energy, how Australia is behind when it comes to electric vehicle adoption, but way ahead of the curve regarding the installation of renewables. Quick thank you to all our Patreon supporters. Without your help, we simply wouldn't be able to carry on. So it's really important. Thank you. And if you would like to support us as well, to support what we do, then have a look at the show notes for all the necessary links. And don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, Acast, Pocket Cast, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Right then, back to my interview with Giles Parkinson. Hello and welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast. I'm very excited. Well, for a start, I'm in the most amazing house with the most amazing view in Australia. It's wonderful, but we're inside and it's nice and cool. And I'm sitting here with Giles Parkinson, who is an ex-financial journalist.
Yes.
And he now writes a blog that I've got obsessed with called Reneweconomy, which even more, I love the strapline, which is fair dinkum power and news analysis. Which is really good, and so that's obviously about renewable energy and the economics of renewable energy. But he's also now producing a new. Did I call that a podcast? A web page, a news blog.
Yes, it's a web page or a news blog.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the other one is The Driven, which is about electric vehicles, which is a growing thing. So, Giles, thank you so much for giving me your time to record.
Thanks for having me on your program.
Well, no, it's really great. It's great fun. You know, the two things that are obvious from being here is the uptake of electric vehicles is probably behind, say, other European countries or Asian countries.
A long way behind, yes.
But the uptake of renewables is definitely out front.
Yeah. It's quite extraordinary, really, in Australia. So what's really happened over the last 10 years is the uptake of rooftop solar. And you think in Australia, well, that's going to be an obvious thing to do.
Yeah.
It's now probably about 1/3 or nearly 1/3 of, say, suitable homes have solar in some states like Queensland and South Australia and Western Australia. But what we're seeing in the last couple of years is this massive rollout of large-scale renewables as well, so solar and wind. And that's pretty exciting. So, and we're starting to see some sort of acceptance that this is actually a good idea, although there's fierce resistance from those who think it's not.
So yes. Which is, it's a bit, but it's more baffling now simply because of the economic arguments. And I think that's where you focus on, is the kind of economics of renewables. As opposed, you're not really writing about there's this new sort of solar panel that's come out. It's more about the macroeconomics of the impact that will have. And
well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, look, one of the things that fascinated me, I started writing about this just over 10 years ago, and I was asked to do an article for an old magazine called The Bulletin, which had been a venerable institution in the Australian media for more than a century. And I was asked to look at what was then the mandatory renewable energy target, which was something introduced by the Conservative government under John Howard.
Right.
And they pulled the plug on it.
Right.
And just as people like Vestas and other people had come in to start building some manufacturing facilities in Australia because they saw the potential, and they pulled the plug on it because they got together with some of the big companies at the time and they all decided it was being too successful.
Right.
Even though we're talking about a minimum amount. But it just dawned on me then that this transition to green energy, and even then with a little bit of investigation, it was clear that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
A little bit like the early days of the internet, you can't really stop technology change. And everybody had been writing about it from a environmental point of view, and no one had been really looking at it from an economic view.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that sort of 12 years on, the economic argument is basically won.
Yeah.
And it was just really interesting hearing. We did an interview of the CEO of the biggest utility in Australia. They're the biggest polluter in Australia because they've got so many coal-fired power stations.
Right.
But he said, look, for the last 5 to 7 years, 10 years, the argument's been about clean versus dirty. He says clean has won because it's cheapest.
Right.
So now it's just a matter of, clean and cheap versus reliable. So, and that's kind of where the argument is now in Australia. If you've got a lot of wind and solar in the system, which we're getting to and got quite a lot in certain states, how do you ensure that that's reliable?
Yeah.
And some people would say that it can't possibly happen. Yes. And a lot of other people say, well, of course it can.
Yeah. And I think we'll discover that it probably will. But now, one of the things that I just read the other day, and I went, I was reading an article about the transition to clean and sustainable energy generation, and I saw this term capacity market, and I went, "Oh, I've heard of that before. I'll ask Giles."
Oh dear, no.
But is it really? Yes. If it's too complicated, don't worry about it. But I just wondered because it's a term I've heard before, and I can't.
Yes,
it's linked to things like base load.
Yes, it's linked to things that people say they can switch on at any one time. So basically, the argument goes is that there's two forms of market. One is your normal energy market, which just basically is a market for kilowatt hours produced.
Right.
And you just pay for the price of that kilowatt hour at a particular time. A capacity market is a bit like a reserve mechanism. So you're actually just paying for plants, and there might be diesel or gas or coal, or even in the modern arena, pumped hydro storage or battery storage, and you're basically paying them to exist. And so they're there. Right. So it's delivering a certain amount of capacity. Now, you might actually only use this sometimes, but or never at all. Yeah. There's a capacity market in Western Australia, which is actually a separate grid. It's probably the smallest big grid in the world, or the biggest small grid in the world, depending on how you want to look at it. But there's one diesel plant which is being built there, and I think it was built about 10 years ago, under the capacity mechanism. It's never been switched on.
But it's been paid for.
It's been paid for, and that's basically it. So it is viewed by the EU and a lot of people as basically a bit of a subsidy to the fossil fuel generators who are whinging loudly about wind and solar eating their lunch, basically, which is what they're doing. And so they push for the capacity market, saying, without a capacity market, the lights will go out, etc. Right. But there's a real big debate about that, and I think there's a lot of tosh and a lot of rubbish. But there is still quite a vigorous debate about it.
Because that does, there is a great example, and now I certainly can't remember the figures, but there is a power company in New England, in the eastern United States, where the guy, the boss at some big event, accidentally revealed the amount of capacity. That's where it all comes from. The amount of capacity they have and how often it's used. And there's a huge chunk, which costs millions every year, that is used for 6% of the year.
Yes.
So it's used at sort of absolute peak winter times. And this was gas. Gas turbine generators.
Well, that's right. Look, the markets have always been basically built on just trying to meet those peak demands. So something that might happen 1% or 2% or 3% a year.
You've got to be able to cover it.
You've got to be able to cover it. Yeah. Interestingly enough, that's basically the way the market has been structured, and that's when all these utilities have made most of their profits. Right. So they'd make about 20% or 30% of their earnings because they switched on something really expensive for about an hour or two a year. And the way the market works is that if you switch on something really, really expensive, everybody operating in the market at that time gets that money.
Yes.
Gets that rate. Right. So a coal generator might cost you $3 a tonne to shovel coal into a big boiler or whatever. Yeah. But at those times, it's getting absolute packet of money. It's sort of built on this sort of scarcity, and you pay for the scarcity, etc. But what's really interesting now is this movement between the capacity market comes in because people say, well, it protects the base load investments. Yeah. What we don't really need now, though, is this old base load, because base load is just kind of a bit of an artifact, a part of a market that was constructed to support the technology at the time, which is essentially coal. And when you need it, you switch on a couple of gas or diesel generators. But base load, the problem with those big coal generators and big nuclear generators in France and elsewhere, for instance, that you can't turn them off. Yeah. So you kind of got to invent demand for them in the middle of the night.
Yes.
And so they've actually got something to do. Yeah. So the issue is still about the dispatchable generation when you need it for short periods of time. And it's really interesting watching the Australian Energy Market Operator, which basically manages the grid and is trying to plan for this transition, and to see where their thinking is coming around. And they're just sort of saying, well, No, sorry, baseload's not the answer. It's got to be dispatchable. It's got to be quick response.
Right.
And the answer in all of that is new technologies.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're talking about battery storage, large and small. You might be talking about electric vehicles.
Yeah.
I think if Australia has 50% electric vehicles, I think, by some time, you pull all that together and you find some way to actually
amount
do
of electricity.
that. Well, it's a huge amount of electricity.
I've just been sent a little video this morning, well, last night in the UK, from a guy who's had one of the first vehicle-to-grid units fitted at his house, so a domestic vehicle-to-grid unit. And I think it's still, to be fair to all parties, early days for that. It's
Very
expensive.
much, yes.
And I think he may have been, having it to test out, and I'm very, very jealous because I haven't got one. But that, I've seen offices, for instance, in Tokyo, that the whole office is run off a big row of Nissan Leafs. So they're all feeding enough electricity to run the office, air conditioning, lights, heat, everything, computers. But they guarantee that each of the people who owns those cars have enough to get home at the end of the day. So they're just using the top 2 or 3% of the battery. They're not like draining the whole battery, which is what people imagine. It's only taking a little bit out. It's whether it damages the battery, it's whether it shortens the battery's life. It sounds like it doesn't. I think it isn't. Because it's not like... if it was taking the same amount of power that accelerating a car hard takes, then you might damage the battery. But you're taking a dribble out, you're taking a dribble back in. But the thing that I've heard, which is the most extraordinary thing, is how much money, which is because of the capacity market, the big battery, the Tesla battery in South Australia is making. It's making millions of dollars a year because it's obviously selling electricity at the absolute peak of peaks for the most money possible, and it's getting it possibly for free from the wind farm that it's next to.
Well, that's right. Well, very cheap. It's actually separate from the wind farm. It actually operates as a separate unit for that. Right. But it's absolutely fascinating what's happening with Tesla. So it actually does get a form of capacity payment from the South Australian government. The South Australian government had a blackout in 2016, and they had this more what they call load shedding, which was basically forcing some people, because they didn't have enough power at some stage, and it was a ridiculous situation. The biggest, most modern gas generator in the country was sitting idle because it couldn't see, the price wasn't high enough for it.
Oh my God.
And the government just went...
When there was a blackout, there actually was the generating capacity to manage it.
Not the statewide blackout. The statewide blackout was because the storm knocked down almost all the power lines. The next one that happened in February, there was a massive load shedding, and it was one stuff up after another. One, the energy market operators seemed to be the only people in Australia who didn't realise there was a heat wave happening. As one politician said, even my 10-year-old knew it was going to be hot. So they hadn't actually made any preparations. There was this gas generator which was sitting there idle. And so it had 240 megawatts of capacity. The market operator only needed 60 megawatts of capacity. And then the local network operator sort of made a complete stuff up of it. It needed to take a certain amount of people off the grid to reduce the demand to match the supply that they did have. And it pressed the wrong button and cut off 3 times more than they needed to. And the government just went, oh, you've got to be kidding me. So they just went out and just said, okay, we've had enough of this. We don't trust the market anymore. We're going to go and do these things. So they put in built a couple of backup diesel generators, which I didn't think was a good idea, but they were actually switched on in another heat wave a couple of weeks ago. And then this they got this big battery, which kind of came out of their expression for it. And then Elon Musk's, one of his representatives said, oh, we can solve that problem. And Michael Canning-Brookes, an Australian billionaire, challenged Elon Musk and said, can you do it? And he goes, I can build it in 100 days or it's free. And okay, all right, okay. And, everyone sort of got on board. And it happened. It's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary it's happened,
And what's really interesting about it is, so it has been making money. It's been getting this, it costs $95 million. It's getting $4 million a year just to be there, to provide network services. So half of the battery, well, not quite half, but I mean, part of the battery is there just to stand there in emergency. And it's actually done some really interesting things. And the other half is playing in what's called the frequency and control market, just like network services. And then another bit of it plays just arbitrage, buying low, selling high and stuff like that. And what's been really interesting is just how this battery has actually changed the whole way of thinking in Australia about electricity. No one had seen one before.
No.
They didn't even know what to call it. They filled out a form and they're going, we've only got forms for wind generators and solar generators. We'll call it a solar generator then, but it's next to a wind farm. Oh, I don't know.
Wow, there wasn't a big thing on the form.
They were basically making it up as they went along. It was quite extraordinary. And but it started working, and it's so quick, it's so fast, it is so versatile.
Yeah.
So it can go from charging 100 megawatts to discharging 100 megawatts in about 0.13 seconds.
Wow.
Now, so it's been able to react to events like coal generators tripping, or wires falling down, or lightning strikes so quickly. Like the coal generators haven't even got out of bed, put their undies on and got their socks on or whatever like that. They've been so slow. And just recently we saw an event where there was a couple of lightning strikes. Australia's a unique grid. It's really stretched out, long transmission lines. There was a couple of lightning strikes in northern New South Wales, just near where we are actually.
Right.
And it had this extraordinary effect right throughout the grid because it caused things to trip. It took away some load and some demand. There was load shedding, so these enforced blackouts for some people in every bit of the country except for South Australia.
Right.
Because of the battery reacted so quickly, it was able to basically hold it together for long enough for the slower moving gas generators to respond. And so all the grids were isolated. The battery kept it going, even though it was more than 50% of the power at the time was coming from rooftop and wind energy. Quite extraordinary. And such a validation that we are moving really from one century to another. And the experts are starting to get their mind around it. They're really exploring as they're going on. They're kind of learning as they're doing. In the meantime, you've got this extraordinary rump of people, the conservatives and the Murdoch media, saying the most stupid things about all this technology, and it's beyond belief. But it's sort of, I think this is the age of ignorance and the age of stupid in so many ways.
It's very difficult. I mean, is it the case? Because I think I've probably said it at dinner parties, liberal elitist dinner parties. But is it the case that, I mean, how have the coal lobby got so much leverage with Australian politicians? I mean, is it just money? And is the Australian legal system, like in America, are politicians allowed to receive funding for their, campaign donations from like big coal mining companies, or I don't know? I mean, it's just baffling how incredibly, because even the Tories in the UK, who I don't have a lot of sympathy with, they're affected by economics, by market forces, and they go, renewables are cheaper. Okay, well, I mean, and they're really annoying. I'm not going to defend them at all. But offshore wind has proven itself to be really cheap, and there's a massive investment in offshore wind in the UK. I mean, it's extraordinary what's going on there. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. You go, if you, I just saw that in the paper, ScoMo, which is, it's helped me remember his name. Scott Morrison, your current prime. It's always important to say current Prime Minister.
Yes,
but he's the guy that held up the coal. I mean, we've talked about the coal before. I don't want to go on about the coal, but that was just bizarre.
It was extraudinary. It was extraordinary. Yes, Well, and when you actually go into the background, it's less bizarre because his chief of staff for 10 years was deputy CEO of the main coal lobby.
Right. Okay.
In Australia,
so there are very obvious, publicly aware links between them.
It's extraordinary. There's a merry-go-round of people who go from the big utilities to the lobby groups to become ministerial and prime ministerial advisors, and then who go to the regulators as well. So it's almost complete regulatory capture. And because it is a complicated business, they've basically been allowed to write the rules and write the policies themselves. And you asked about the central proprietary amongst ministers. 3 of the last 4 energy ministers in Australia, within months of leaving their job, started working for fossil fuel lobby groups.
Wow.
No,
Directly for the lobby groups. And of course, they'll know everybody.
Groups.
They've worked in the office. They know everyone. They know who to talk to.
They know who to talk to.
If you're a lobby group, that's the guy you want.
It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. There are actually rules in Australia that say you shouldn't do this, but no one seems to care. We had a trade minister who was negotiating. Well, there's a bit off topic, but he was negotiating the sale of a port in Darwin to a Chinese company. Even before he left Parliament, he got a job with a Chinese company. And you're just going, hang on,
you're supposed to do that.
You're supposed to do that.
I mean,
the
same thing happens. That does happen in the UK. The rotating door between government, the Foreign Office, massive companies, lobbying groups. That's the same people doing it. From your analysis of the economics of it, is it now fair to say that renewables are cheaper.
It is.
Renewables are cheaper.
I don't think there's any doubt now.
Right.
I don't think there's any doubt. And just as by way of example, some of the new wind and solar farms have been contracted in Australia are being contracted over 20-year prices of around $40 to $50 a megawatt hour in Australia.
Wow.
Now that is actually significantly cheaper than the average price of electricity in the wholesale market over the year. So, and those prices are being driven by those supposedly fully depreciated coal generators and brown coal generators and what have you. So now that is an average price over time. But what's happening in Australia is that, we've got pathetic regulators and pathetic rules. So really they're not intervening in the market, and these guys are just creaming the market. They dominate the market. Right. It's a problem in Australia in many industries. It's a rich economy, but it's a small economy comparatively. So each industry gets dominated by 2 or 3 large players, and they just basically they dominate the market. They write the rules. They screw the consumers, and it's all very unsavoury. So now they can kind of see that the end of their domination is happening, and so they are basically charging extraordinary prices when they can for the output. But also the cost of coal and the cost of gas generation is rising because the actual cost of those resources is rising. So that's basically that's the wind and solar, just the actual cost of sort of delivery of electricity. And it's really interesting to note that the market operator in the CSIRO, which is our principal scientific and research organisation, they did a very major study just last December, which said, okay, we've got a lot of renewables coming in the system. We've got a lot of coal generators. Most of them are going to have to retire because they're really, really old. Actually, a lot of them are about, the average age is about 36 years. They've got a supposed life of 50, but mostly across the world, the experience is they usually retire after about 42 because the cost of maintenance in the last 5 or 10 years is exorbitant. So they said, well, that's all going to retire. What are we going to build in its place? What's going to be the cheapest? And they just said, look, it's absolutely a no-brainer. It actually surprised them. Wow. They said, look, it kind of knocked us off our feet. We didn't understand just how cheap this was, but a mixture of wind or solar or both, mixed with battery storage or pumped hydro for longer periods of storage is by far is the cheapest. Right. And because it's more flexible and you can use it when you want, and it doesn't sort of sit there, do nothing, wanting something to do in the middle of the night. Yeah. And so that's where we're heading, and I think the transition in Australia is going to happen really quickly. Right. I think it's going to happen. I think we're going to go to very high levels of renewables very quickly. We might not be 100% because I think it's that last 5 or 10%. That's the hard bit. So probably keep a few things going, and look, maybe someone will get a capacity market out of it, or who knows what mechanism they'll need to sort of keep that online. But in South Australia, that state, and it's an island state, it's the end of the grid, it's already at about 55% wind and solar. That's not been done anywhere in the world. It's got all these new wind and solar farms being built right now. The market operator says that probably by 2026, 27, it'll effectively be 100% renewables.
Because even now, there are days when it's 100% and it's exporting power.
Absolutely. It's exporting power,
yes. So the 50% is kind of the average over the year.
That's right.
Which is incredible. I mean, there's I don't think there is. I mean, other than, you could argue Norway, Sweden, Norway, I suppose, because they've got so much hydro.
Absolutely.
So much, and a very small population. I mean, even by Australians, I think there's 3.5 million Norwegians, and they've got like 2.5 million mountains with lakes on. That's rather unfair on the rest of us. Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, they've got a bit of advantage. So South Australia, interestingly, has no hydro whatsoever. Right. So all their renewables is wind and solar. Right. Wow. Really quite extraordinary. It's mostly been wind up to now, and a bit of quite a lot of rooftop solar. Now we're starting to see these really big solar plants being built there. And and it's interesting. I mean, the market operator is learning as it's going along. Yeah. So it got a bit worried about after these incidents a couple of years ago in South Australia. So it imposed new rules. It kind of put a limit on the amount of wind that could be generated at any one time, and made sure it had enough gas units operating. But it's really interesting to see what they're doing now. Yeah. Every couple of months they relax those rules. Right. They gain confidence in the system. So they've actually increased the amount of wind capacity that can blow at any one time to almost the full capacity that actually exists. So they're kind of learning, they're getting more comfortable. Yeah. They are very, very aware that any more blackouts It's going to be a really bad idea.
It's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
Don't do that, please. Don't do that. So they're really just trying to manage it down and micromanage, and they're really very conservative, but they kind of know that they've got to go there.
Yeah. I mean, what is fascinating in a way is because obviously I have a connection with Australia being married to one, but I don't search out Australian stories about renewables and about batteries and about they've come to me. It's not me, which tells me that outside Australia there's a lot of attention on what Australia is doing, what it's achieving, what their lessons they're learning. A lot of the rest of the world is going, which is it's extraordinary. It's exactly the opposite of Australian electric cars, not that big a take-up. Australian renewables, world leading. This is what's becoming increasingly apparent to me. That we know what solar panels are, we know what a wind turbine is, we know we can make bigger ones, cheaper ones, all that. How do you operate that power?
Yeah.
How does the software, in a way, operate, the legal system, the financial system of it?
And it's not just that. It was the head of China's State Grid, which is the biggest utility in the world, had something interesting to say a couple of years ago. He said, look, it's not really about hardware or software. It's actually about a cultural thing.
Yeah.
It's a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's really quite... But the resistance from the incumbent industries, as you can imagine, is furious. And one of my favourite stories is about Hawaii, which imports basically everything it uses, all its oil, both for cars and for electricity.
Right.
And it's horrendously expensive. So it's where solar and battery storage and wind power is absolutely no-brainer because it's so much cheaper. And the utilities with their existing gas and diesel assets, they fought against this transition forever. But they had a very, very strong governor and very, very strong sort of local congress. And they said, no, we're going 100% renewables and we want to do it by 2045. And the utilities were saying, you're mad, you're crazy, it's going to kill the economy, the lights are going out. And the governor and the congress said, no, we're going to do it. It is now in law, you will do it. And the utilities turned around and said, we can actually do it by 2035 or 2040, actually.
Right, yeah. We can do it sooner.
We can do it sooner.
Yeah, of course.
So they fought to protect their incumbent interests. As soon as the policy changed, they dealt with that. It's extraordinary, And we've actually got it. We've now got a federal energy minister who really doesn't like wind and solar. He keeps on saying there's too much of it in the system. But and at the moment he's trying to engineer this auction to get a new coal-fired power station for his buddies and some of the party donors. I mean, look, it is obscene as it sounds. It really is. Right. It really is appalling and pointless. But look, in the end, if he gets away with giving some of his best buddies some money, it's not going to matter. It's not going to stop the transition. It's going to happen. Even if they get back into power, they really can't stop it. No. It's but it would just make a lot more sense. It'd be a lot cheaper if they kind of got out of the way and let it happen and were encouraging. Yeah. And it would kind of be more important too, because in Australia, as you may have noticed over the last couple of months, we're starting to see the effects of weather extremes and things. Yeah. So we've now got this wonderful economic and technology argument to go forward quickly. Yeah. And we've kind of forgotten about the environmental imperative.
Yes.
But there's no excuse not to embrace it anymore. Yeah.
No, because I mean, those are things I didn't, when I hear that there's temperatures of like 47, 48 degrees in Adelaide, I just think, it's hot in Australia. But, I've been reminded, no, mate, not that hot.
Yes, not supposed to be.
It's a bit special hot.
Yes, we just went down to Tasmania, we had a couple of weeks down there, and we were really lucky because it was beautiful weather, but unfortunately it was a little bit too beautiful, so everything was incredibly dry, and then it got very hot. Right. So we're seeing some really sad things now with the burning out of some of these wilderness areas and forests which have not seen fire for thousands of years and 1,000-year-old forests, and they're not supposed to burn. I mean, a lot of Australia is supposed to burn because there's gum trees and they sort of regenerate, but these things, these are rainforests.
There's also that simple thing of, the 20 hottest years ever recorded in Australia have all happened in the last 21 years. I mean, that gives you a slight clue.
Which makes you admire the determination of the Murdoch media to sort of announce in one of its outlet every day that it's getting colder. Yeah. The sheer determination to look at facts and to look at scientific reports and say that's not true is extraordinary.
Well, the other one I just read this morning, which was because someone tweeted this to me. The scientists are lying again, and there's this incredibly complex way of measuring temperature and aggregating multiple different points of measuring temperature over the last 100 years and how you do that. And the argument is, has the temperature increased globally 1 degree or 1.274. You know, it's like this tiny fraction, and the scientists have aggregated all these numbers and gone, actually I think it's 1.27, but it isn't like they're going, it hasn't gone up or it's gone up 10 degrees. It's not that. It's gone up 1 degree. We all accept that. Everyone accepts that. The whole global temperature has risen 1 degree, which is, you know, sounds like nothing. That's catastrophically dangerous.
Yeah, it is.
Because it's the whole world. It's not like the warm bits.
And it's an average. And so in some bits, like Tasmania, we were down there looking at the seals. We went out in the water there and we're talking to the biologists, and they said the water temperature has risen 2 degrees in the last 4 years.
Wow.
They're getting tropical fish. Nemo is going down there, getting swept down by warm tropical currents. They end up in Tasmania. They die in the end because, you know, a current is just a current. But, and the waters do go eventually go down. But, you know, it's just extraordinary what we're seeing. I was in the water this morning, and I thought it was pretty warm. I went, hang on, this is pretty warm. This is a bit unusual for this time of the year.
Would you say it is warmer here than it normally is? The water.
Definitely.
Right. But that's probably just this. That's not necessarily a global change.
It's not necessarily, no, but one of the scary things that we're worried about is there's this horrible little jellyfish called the irukandji. They're about the size of, well, less than the size of your fingernail, and they're absolutely deadly.
Wow.
And they only occur in tropical waters.
And they're down here?
They're about 300 kilometres north.
Wow.
They're supposed to be 1,000 kilometres north. And
so the
warmer
south.
waters are coming south.
Wow.
If that comes down here, this basically kills this area because people swim in the beach. With irukandji, you cannot swim unless you feel like wearing a giant stocking from head to toe.
Right.
That's not going to look quite good on the beach anymore. So, you know, these impacts.
And also, I mean, even I'm really rubbish at telling this, but because it did rain the other day, didn't it? But before that, when we were walking through the forest the other day, I went, God, this is not like I remember it.
Yes.
Because it's quite rainforesty. It's not quite as sort of super tropical rainforest as Queensland, but it's still.
Look at my poor lawn, it's patchy. I mean,
so normally that would be very green and.
Normally I've got to mow that lawn every week.
Right.
And I haven't mowed it since first week in January.
Wow.
Our average January rainfall, because I've got a little rain gauge out there, our average January rainfall is 160 millimetres. This year we got 3.
Oh, that's quite a big change.
It is a bit. The lowest ever, about 40 years ago, was 30-something.
Wow.
This is 3. And if you look at the back, we've actually got, we rely on rain tanks for our water because we're not connected to the mains. And, you know, this is supposed to be the wet season. Yeah. And we're about a quarter full.
Wow.
And we're going to have to sort of ring up the man to come and give us a water delivery if it
didn't fill up the other day when it rained. It did rain, or did it not rain here?
Not much here. Yeah, it rained on the coastline, but we're about 15 k's in. And I was on my surfboard and I was looking back and I was just going, is that a cloud in the distance? Is that in my house? I was going, yes. And I came up and I looked at the rain gauge and went, oh no, there's nothing in it.
Yeah. What I like though is the fact that your beautiful house here, and also that you clearly go in the sea a lot.
Yes.
You know, so what a lousy, miserable lifestyle you have.
It's awful.
I don't know how you cope with the stresses.
I don't know why I didn't do it earlier, actually, because I've been working from home for the last 15 years, and I was living in Sydney, in the big city, and the traffic and everything like that. And just one day, my kids just said to me, Dad, what are you doing here?
But then, see, for me, when I go to Sydney, I go, this is the most beautiful city in the whole universe ever. I do love it, but then...
Try and drive around it.
Yeah, no, I haven't had to drive. I did a tiny bit, you've got to stay in your lane. I learnt that. I did a bit of lane wobbling, got a lot of abuse. Stay in your lane, you dongo! Now the one last thing I wanted to see what your opinion was that I've been hearing a lot about, which is small-scale nuclear. So, like, we're talking container. I don't know if you know anything, but Sweden is developing a lot of very small-scale nuclear. I've actually filmed on a nuclear hunter-killer submarine. It was really interesting talking to the engineer. This was off camera because I wasn't allowed to see the engine room. It was top secret. But he opened the door. I saw some white pipes. You know, I could be tortured and I won't be able to give away any secrets. But they've had small-scale nuclear reactors. It has to be said, very safe, very reliable. They can stay out. That thing can stay underwater for like 6 months. Treating water, creating oxygen, keeping the crew alive. You know, I mean, that's incredible. With no oxygen, no air, doesn't come up to the surface. Which gives you the impression that that scale of nuclear might be a very different solution to the big, you know, the ridiculous thing we're building in the UK at the moment. Yeah. Hinkley Point C is just bonkers, and it will be years overdue, and it will cost double what they first said. And the cost of the grid infrastructure needed for it, which is something that no one ever talks about. You know, it's been colossal amount to put the grid connectors into it.
Well, not just the grid connectors, the backup, because if you've got a big generator and operating a big system, you have to allow for the failure of the biggest unit.
Right.
And this is the monstrous unit. So the National Grid actually did a calculation, worked out over the life of the scheme, the backup, the gas generators that would have to be on standby, just in case this thing fell over, would cost about $12 billion over the life of this. That's just for the backup. Wow. That's just how insane it is. So notionally small modular nuclear reactors make sense notionally, but the trouble is, no one's, you know, if you could take it out of the submarine and put it, you know, somewhere, they would have done it by now, but it's just ridiculous expensive. So Department of Defence don't reveal their budget. So yes, they've done it really well. They put it in subs and aircraft carriers and other things. It costs a gazillion. And all the studies point to the fact that it's nuclear needs scale, so it actually needs to keep on getting bigger. Now these people are saying, oh no, we can do it smaller, but none of the studies say that it'll be anywhere near cheap enough. And if you think about where solar is going, so solar, you're starting to see contracts in the US and in Mexico and in Chile and in the Middle East of, you know, 1 cent to 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And it's going to get cheaper. It's going to get cheaper. It's going to halve in price.
But I mean, the important thing to point out is that they are charging 1 or 2 cents a kilowatt hour and making enough to cover the cost of it and to make a profit.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, it's pretty obvious. They don't have to buy any fuel. Because I mean, that's always been my argument about nuclear. I've always said I'm quite happy to have a nuclear power station in my backyard. I think they're really safe. They've got, you know, even if you count the kind of, it is literally 3 nuclear disasters. That's out of hundreds of nuclear power stations that have run for decades, very, very safely, not kill people. The problem is all that waste, which is now a problem in France. They're running out of place to store the colossal amounts of nuclear waste. What do we do with that? But more importantly, who pays for it? Because we are paying through the nose in the UK to maintain this colossal legacy, which we've inherited from our fathers, effectively, the nuclear waste from the early days of it's still there. It ain't going nowhere. Our children will inherit it from us. Theirs will inherit it. That's got to be there for thousands of years. And no one has ever explained to me how that makes economic sense. That costs money to look after that, a lot of money.
Absolutely, yeah. There was a bit of a push in Australia, in South Australia. Some conservative politicians wanted to turn parts of South Australia into a big repository. We'll take everyone's nuclear waste. But that didn't seem like a very bright idea in the end. I think
just put it all in, just some old tin boxes in the desert. There was a bit of nuclear waste probably still, and the British did a few.
Oh, there is a bit, yeah, absolutely, yeah. We got quite close to building nuclear reactors about 40, 50 years ago in Australia. There's a great big lump of concrete in a place called Jarvis Bay, which was actually supposed to be the foundations of the first one, but in the end it was never done. But back to the small nuclear reactors, look, maybe 10, 20 years time, maybe that'll be important for some of those big northern economies which don't have much sunshine, have got bigger challenges going to 100% renewables. Maybe those are sort of some of the things, but in a country like Australia, I think the argument will be long gone by then. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Giles. That's really good of you.
It's been fun.
That was. I've learnt a lot, and I'm very excited that it's been worth me coming to Australia to find out these things. That's my excuse. Yes, I came to see my mother-in-law, who's amazing. Please do subscribe to this podcast. There's loads of ways of doing it, isn't there? I'm not even going to go on about them now. And do check out the Fully Charged show on YouTube, which you probably already know about, and there's some great episodes coming. Johnny Smith's just driven the new Honda that no one's even seen, and he's got exclusive access to that. So there's lots to come on that, and as always, if you have been, thank you for listening.